5 historians, and welcome to our next lesson in our Nazi Germany topic. This lesson we are looking at attempts to overthrow the Republic, and in particular focusing on the Beer Hall Putsch. Now you may remember this from Rise of Evil when we watched that just obviously before Christmas. It is one of the the key points on Hitler's journey towards becoming Chancellor of Germany. A really interesting series of events. So what we're really trying to do with this particular lesson is to be able to describe the events of the Beer Hall Putsch as well as the impact of these. We're also going to be looking at Hitler's trial and the aftermath of the putsch, and there are some links back to Rise of Evil, which is in the file section of the team if you wanted to go back and watch this particular bit again, just so you've got a visual representation obviously of roughly what happened during the event. So make sure you've got a heading someplace in your notes and then continue the lesson. So as you probably remember, people in Germany were generally quite unhappy with the events that had transpired since the end of the war in 1918. They were unhappy with particular issues, as well as just the economic situation they found themselves in. So in particular, the surrender during World War I, the impact of the Treaty of Versailles, the effects of the economic problems that actually had happened, so hyperinflation as well as other things like industry and unemployment and things like that. So generally a very unhappy point in time at this bit for people in Germany. Okay, you don't have to write this slide, it's just a nice recap of what we already know. Generally speaking, these German people blamed various different groups for this. So they blamed the Jews, which was a very common thing because anti-Semitism was quite common in Germany at this point in time. They blamed the communists, and above all else, they blamed the Weimar government. These people in charge who had, along with the Jews and the communists, stabbed Germany in the back. And you can see this cartoon here demonstrates this idea. We've got this random stereotypical Jewish person who is stabbing what looks like a German soldier in the field in the back with a very long dagger. So these right-wing and nationalist Germans really wanted to remove these people from power, these traitors in the Weimar government, Eber and his government, who they saw as responsible for pretty much all of Germany's problems. Now, they're not thinking about this as in terms of the war has caused these issues and the result of the negotiations at trying to get peace, which they had to do, is what's happened here. They're thinking about this in terms of Germany is basically being stabbed in the back, it's been betrayed. There was no way they were actually going to lose the war, it was just a complete disaster for Germany because they had surrendered too early. They're forgetting the situation that they were in the war because there's so much publicity and so much propaganda surrounding this idea that there had been no invasion of Germany and they were continuing to fight, so why did they have to surrender? Even though today we know that that obviously wasn't the case and their situation was particularly bad, they are not thinking about that at the time. They're thinking about the glory days of Germany where they were doing really, really well. So that's something to just keep in mind with that. So, after the Great War, okay, and this is the first thing that you should be writing. Now remember, we're not writing everything on the slides, we're summarising and highlighting the key points that we need. So after the Great War had happened, Hitler returns to Munich, where the army gave him a job of spying on political groups, just to see if they were dangerous to the government. Okay, and we saw that happening in Rise of Evil. He was sent to investigate a small political party called the German Workers' Party, which only had about 40 members at the time. It had very little money, no real political ideas apart from the fact that they disliked Weimar, them and everyone else at this point in time, and they wanted to make Germany great again. That was their mantra that they were trying to work with. Hitler liked the party's ideas, he hated Weimar, he wanted Germany to be great again, and so instead of actually just reporting on them, which he did do, he actually joined in 1919, and very quickly he was put in charge of the party's propaganda. He put adverts in papers, he organised and held meetings in the beer halls and in bars and things like that, and eventually he becomes part of their speaking sort of groups, where he's standing up and actually delivering this propaganda message to the party. Now, ultimately, he becomes the leader of the party in 1921, and one of the first things he does is he changes the name of the party to the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, which is where the acronym Nazi Party comes from. We'll talk about this and the reason for him changing it in a little bit more detail later on, but I want you to kind of think about what these particular names would mean. Nationalist, Socialist, German, Workers. Which groups in society do you think that name is trying to target? By November 1923, the Nazi Party have 50,000 members. So they go from being this really small political party with 40 in 1918 period, and to this gigantic party that is definitely a force to be reckoned with politically. So, key points that we need from this slide. We need the heading that says after the Great War, and we need to just make a point that he returned to Munich, where the army gave him the job of spying on political groups to see if they were dangerous to the government. And that was a very skew if highlighting there, look at that. He investigated the German Workers' Party, which only had 40 members. I'm going to say it had no real political ideas apart from disliking the Weimar Republic and wanting to make Germany great again. And then Hitler joined in 1919, was put in charge of propaganda. So that's just the key points from that slide that we need there. So feel free to pause that and either highlight if you've got your own copy of it or just to take a quick note of that. If you want to kind of see how this point happens, we can go back to Rise of Evil and you can check that out. I will put just a link of this into the team to let you know what point in time to go back into the episode so that you can check that out in a wee bit more detail. Or I'll put the clip into the playlist on YouTube so you can go and watch this, him investigating the party and then joining. So, we've talked about putschs before. We've talked about the Wolfgang Kapp Putsch, we have talked about the Spartakists Putsch, we are now talking about the Munich Putsch, so we need to know what is a putsch. Okay, basically it is the word that is used in German for an armed takeover of power with an aim to bring down the government. So the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party believed the people were fed up with the Weimar government, and they decided it was the right time to overthrow this group, which remember they refer to as the November Criminals. At the time, a lot of people hadn't actually heard of the Nazi Party, but this is going to change quite quickly with this being the kind of catalyst for that. Just as a quick aside, Mein Kampf, which is Hitler's autobiography, his struggle, is one of the kind of key books from Hitler's ideology, where it talks about what he thought should happen, and a lot of the party's ideals politically were based on this. Anybody know when and where he actually wrote it? If you do, feel free to comment in the team, but you will find out quite shortly. So, for things that we kind of need to say here for what is a putsch, we just need to make a point. It was an armed takeover of power with the aim to bring down the government. And we need this bit here. So the National Socialist German Workers' Party believed people were fed up with the Weimar government and decided it was time to overthrow the November Criminals. So key point there. So ultimately, why a putsch? Why is this something that Hitler actually wants to do? Now, as leader of this party, he knew that the ideals that they actually had of trying to start a revolution was something that he could get the people behind if he did it at the right time. So he wants to start a revolution basically before the government could get its act together and solve Germany's problems. He saw an opportunity. And basically what he did was he seized it. So the government of Bavaria, where he was living at this point in time, were potentially going to be overthrown by some other parties and groups that were around. Hitler saw this as an opportunity. He knew that if he was able to strike when the Weimar government was weak and prove that they were weak, he would get people to follow him. So the idea was that he would follow on with this sort of planning to take over the government of Bavaria. After the success of that, he would prove that he was a strong, capable leader, and his party were so much better than the potential government that they already had. And then what they would do is they would march on Berlin. There would be so much support and so much excitement about what they were doing that the revolution would just start. And this popular wave of excitement and focus with him in charge and his party in charge would just sweep away the Weimar government completely from power. And that was kind of his overall plan. So remember, key points from this slide, we're saying why a putsch, and we're just going to say Hitler wanted to start a revolution before the government could do anything to solve Germany's problems, because remember, if you are living in a situation that you are not liking and the government doesn't seem to be doing anything, you're more likely to vote for extremist groups or people who are saying the opposite. It gives them something to promise. They will fix these problems. If the government fixed them, then there's nothing for them to do. So he saw an opportunity. Okay, planning to take over the government of Bavaria, march on Berlin, and start the revolution. Obviously, to take part in this putsch, Hitler needed supporters that obviously looked like they were going to be behind the Nazi party and what they were trying to do with this revolution. And he did actually have some quite powerful supporters as well. These included the politician Gustav von Kahr, who was quite influential at this point in time. He also had the Bavarian army's leader, Otto von Lossow, again, really important army leader moving forward. And probably one of the most important people behind him was the wartime leader and national hero Erich von Ludendorff, who was a known backer, according to Hitler anyway, of the Nazis and the Nazi party. Now, having these people behind him kind of added a level of legitimacy to what Hitler actually was trying to do. It made it look like people who were, you know, quite high-ranking, quite important people with a lot of support of their own were really, really behind what Hitler and the Nazis were trying to do. So he was trying to take that level of support that these people had and then use that moving forward. So, ultimately what actually happened at the beer hall putsch. Now, really good way to kind of summarise your information for this is through gridding. You know, I'm a big fan of gridding or mind mapping, but if that is not for you in either of these particular formats, feel free to kind of do it as a list. We're thinking about events that actually happened. So you can kind of distill this into 10 main events, okay? So if you're doing it as a grid, you need a heading and you need to have 10 boxes to write something in. If you're doing it as a mind map, you can put that in the middle and write your 10 things around it. If you're doing it as a list in your notes, then again you're heading with your kind of points moving forward. And I've put this up like this. You can kind of see some pictures that represent what was going on. See if you can kind of work out what each of them mean. We'll look at the next slide to actually tell you, so you have the information to fill in, but you could then go back to it and see if you can work out what each thing is, a little bit like catchphrase. So, in terms of the events of the beer hall putsch of 1923, we know that the National Socialist German Workers' Party believed that people were fed up with the Weimar government and decided it was the right time to overthrow the November criminals. Okay, we don't have to write that in our grid because we've said that. They decided to strike in the southern town of Munich, which was in Bavaria, on the 8th of November 1923, just at the same time as an important meeting was going to be taking place there in a local beer hall. And that was quite a common place for parties and political groups to meet to discuss things at that point in time. Bavaria was under the control of 3 right-wing leaders, State Governor von Kahr, the head of the army, General Otto Loslow, we've already mentioned these two, and the commander of the state police, von Seisser. So these 3 men are kind of key to what we're talking about here. First off, Hitler went and enlisted the help of the World War I military commander and hero Ludendorff, and then after he had secured that help, he and 600 brown shirts surrounded the beer hall that they knew this meeting was taking place in. Hitler then stormed into the room when he was completely sure that the whole hall was surrounded and all the exits were secure, and had 25 of the Nazis with him in uniform, and he jumped up either onto a stage or onto a chair at this time, and he fired gunshots into the air. And he shouted, "The National Revolution has begun." This got everybody's attention. He then needed to convince the 3 important men that they should side with him at this point in time, not only to legitimise what he was doing, but also to make sure that all of the people involved at that point in time in the beer hall and in the wider area of Munich actually marched with them and agreed to help, because if they didn't have the numbers, it was very unlikely that they would manage to get the revolution to actually happen. He ordered them into a private room at the back of the beer hall at gunpoint, and they refused to support Hitler at first. However, when they found out that the very respected war hero Ludendorff was involved and that he was actually on his way, they agreed that they would change their minds. They waited a little while for Ludendorff to actually come, because he had spent a little bit of time getting dressed in all of his military finery and with all his medals and things like that to make an impression when he arrived. When he did arrive, he then obviously explained that he was in support of the Nazis, and these 3 important men agreed to support Hitler and what he was doing, and that meant the rest of the group also did as well. So we're looking for any key points from this, okay, that you can put into the events of what actually happened. So key things that we maybe need to say is starting with point 3. So Bavaria was under the control of von Kahr, General Otto Loslow and von Seisser. Okay. And then we've got the help from Ludendorff and the brown shirts surrounding the hall. Hitler storming in's our next point with 25 Nazis, firing the gunshots and shouting, "The National Revolution has begun." Ordered the 3 important men. So he needed to get the support of the 3 important men, ordered them to go to a private room at gunpoint as 1 point together. And then this last bit, they refused to support Hitler, however changed their minds when General Ludendorff arrived. So that's the first bits that we actually need there. So pause the video to fill in your grid or your mind map or your notes, whatever you've decided to do, and then move on to the next slide to finish it off. Hitler then returned to the main beer hall to give a speech, and in the speech he stated that the Weimar Republic, the November criminals, had led Germany to this economic disaster point. They had basically meant that Germany was in ruins at this point. He also gave the impression that he had the support of the 3 important men, and ultimately things seemed to be going quite well. He was then called away from the beer hall, and when he was not there, von Kahr, Loslow and von Seisser promised Ludendorff that they supported Hitler, but they needed to go home because their wives would worry. So they left. Once they were free, von Kahr immediately issued the stated "statements forced on me by pistol point are null and void," contract. He shouted that and he contacted the police, telling the people in the beer hall not to support the Nazis and that he didn't actually mean what he had said. He was being forced to do it, and he told the police that Hitler and the Nazis were planning to march. Ludendorff convinced Hitler that they should march anyway into the centre of Munich the next morning. He argued that the police would never fire on him if he was at the front of the group because he was the war hero, and Hitler had very little choice. Either had to agree to do it or he would lose credibility. So the next day, the 9th of November, 3,000 Nazis marched behind Hitler and Ludendorff. They entered a narrow street where the armed police were ready for them, and violence broke out between the brown shirts and the Bavarian police. So other key things that we need is that Hitler returned to the main beer hall and gave a speech. Also gave the impression that he had the support of the important men, and that's one point there. Hitler was called away. Von Kahr, von Lossow and von Seisser promised Ludendorff that they supported Hitler, then left, and again still one point. Once freed, von Kahr issued the statement and contacted the police. The next day, on the 9th of November, the Nazis marched behind Ludendorff, and violence broke out between the brown shirts and the Bavarian police. So that's key points that we need. Again, pause to add to your grid or your mind map from your key points or to your notes, and then move on to the last slide to just finish off this section. So after the violence broke out, shots were actually fired. Now nobody knows who actually fired first, but 16 Nazis and 3 policemen were actually killed, so that's a good point to add into what happened. The shooting lasted less than a minute, and that was it. The putsch was over. In the aftermath, Hitler managed to escape with a dislocated shoulder, but was captured and stood trial for treason. Okay, now treason came with the death penalty normally. Ludendorff was also captured, but was acquitted, and then he would later on cut his ties with the Nazi party. Basically, Hitler had failed because he didn't have the support of the army or really the full support of the German people. And at this point in time, a lot of people thought that that was it, the Nazi party was finished with. However, during the trial, Hitler actually explained how what he'd done was try to save Germany from what he saw as an economic disaster. Ultimately, he was allowed to make speeches at his trial, which was not common. He got the sympathy of a lot of people, and he ended up being sentenced to prison for 5 years for treason rather than the death penalty, which is what normally would have happened and had happened to the Spartakists during their revolution attempt for treason. In prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle. In this book, he showed his political ideas and what his plans were for the future. He only served 9 months, which was not harsh at all compared to the punishment for the Spartakists at this point either. So basically what we're going to say for this is that during the trial, Hitler explained how he tried to save Germany, and he was sent to prison for 5 years for treason. In prison he wrote Mein Kampf. He only served 9 months. And you can put these things together, which make up the entire events of the Munich Putsch. So we're going to kind of think a little bit more about Hitler's trial using the next couple of slides. This newspaper, and sorry it's not particularly great quality picture, but this newspaper was issued at the time that Hitler and Ludendorff's trial started. And what I want you to think about is, what does this actually tell us about the importance of Hitler at the time of the Munich Putsch? So this idea is showing us that the trial of Ludendorff was the main focus of the propaganda pieces at the time. Hitler was not a well-known name. He wasn't considered to be a great war hero. He had been awarded the Iron Cross, which did make him a decorated war veteran, but not a hero in the same level that Ludendorff actually was considered. So the trial was more about Ludendorff. He was the main focus at this point in time. And during the events of the trial, Hitler actually shifted that focus away from Ludendorff and onto him, and made himself a household name. Now, this is going to be important later on because it establishes him as a force to be reckoned with. So while he was actually on trial, he was on trial for treason, like we've said. When he was found guilty, the sentence should have been death, but instead he was given 5 years, and he was paroled after 9 months. The Spartakists, who had tried to overthrow the government a few years before that, had been executed, as was said, for this crime, and they weren't allowed to speak in their defence at the trial the same way that Hitler was. Instead, Hitler turned the trial into this spectacular success for the Nazis. His speeches inside the trial were reported all over Germany, with radio and with newspapers. Everybody seemed to know what was going on with this trial, and they followed it as a series. He kind of used Ludendorff's name to establish it as something people should be interested in, and then made it about him and about his ideals and the Nazi party. So people followed along, kind of the same way as they would follow along with a reality TV show today. Don't have to write anything on this side down because we've already kind of talked about that. Hitler argued that he was trying to save Germany from a weak government. He was photographed standing beside Ludendorff, as you can see here, at the trial, which made that people think that Hitler was actually as important as Ludendorff was, and they began to question, actually, who are these Nazi people? What do they stand for? What are they about? And the more that these questions started being asked, the more and more the popularity of the party started to rise. So even though the putsch was a failure, there was actually more people joining the party at this point in time than there had been before. Again, don't have to write this, we're just looking it over. Now, if you think about these two photos, it's the same photo, but what is different about how one would have been displayed and the other? So the main focus of, obviously, this one in the corner is that it's all about these two men, whereas this one shows kind of everybody who was involved. And to be perfectly honest, given all of the medals and the uniforms, Hitler is kind of fairly eclipsed compared to the rest of them, whereas this one puts him on the same kind of level standing as Ludendorff. So both are at the trial and they're both the same photo, but Hitler has himself and Ludendorff cropped out to emphasise this. We are the same person and the same level. So the question is, why was he more or less let off? You can see this picture here of Hitler sitting enjoying his breakfast in his prison cell, reading the newspaper. The reason he was more or less let off is that he had important friends who sympathised with his views and made sure that he was not seriously punished. They hated the Weimar democracy, but they also feared communism, and this was kind of one of the main reasons that they were supporting the more extremist, all opposite views politically, like the Nazi party. Hitler said the things that they actually liked to hear as well when he was doing the speeches, like the Treaty of Versailles was a disgrace, communism had to be destroyed, the politicians had stabbed Germany in the back. He was repeating the things that had been said and felt by the people since the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. But one of the most important things he did was he said that even though things were bad in Germany, they could make Germany great again, could be proud and great and strong once more if they followed a certain path. Now, obviously he means his path, but it didn't matter what he actually meant by that. It was just important that it made it out that he had the solutions to the problems that the people were facing. And you can see the trial happening in the Rise of Evil clip. Again, this is available in the team, but I'll also try and put some in the playlist for you as well. Feel free to watch it so you've got this overview. It's a nice way to kind of do that. So, to make sure that we understand the importance of Hitler's trial, we're just going to do a quick task with this one. There's a worksheet about Hitler's trial that you should complete. There's 5 questions using the information that's on the sheet and the last couple of slides. to finish those 5 general questions off before you move on to the last part of this lesson. So now that we know about the Beer Hall Putsch or the Munich Putsch, the two names are the same thing, we're going to think about what the impact of it was. And to do this, what I want you to do is create a table with positive on one side and negative on the other side. Or you can colour code the statements as they kind of come up. And then I want you to use the information on this slide to decide which were the positive impacts of it and which were the negative ones. And then we can go over this. So first thing we've got is that the trial gave Hitler publicity and now everyone had heard of the Nazis. Hitler was not seriously punished. Think about what had happened to the Spartakists. He only serves 9 months of the sentence that was lenient anyway. He did, however, break his shoulder or dislocate his shoulder escaping. The putsch had failed and the Nazi Party and their newspapers were banned until 1925, which meant that they were isolated from politics. A complete ban was put on them as a party. Many people in Germany sympathised with Hitler's ideas, and when the party was banned, this actually increased the number of people who were maybe interested in them. 16 Nazis were dead, and they were seen as martyrs or heroes. In jail for 9 months gave Hitler the opportunity to actually write Mein Kampf, which put all of the Nazi ideas into paper, so he kind of had a way forward. Also, whilst in prison, he had time to realise that if he wanted control of Germany, he'd have to do it through democratic means. Revolutions were not going to happen quickly or easily. The best way for him to get power was to be elected to power, to be legitimately there. In jail, he also reorganised the party. He decided where people would actually go, what the SS would do, who the SA were going to be. He developed the element of the swastika being used more and more, and he established the Hitler Youth idea that he would put into practice when he came to power. So you're going to decide of these impacts, which ones are positive and which ones are negative, and put them into the table. So pause the video here at 32 minutes and fill it in. Oh, extra one there. Hitler was shown to be a criminal, hot-headed, unplanned and guilty of treason. So pause the video at 32 minutes and 11 seconds and fill the table in. Okay, so hopefully you did pause this and you did your own table. If not, you can copy this one, that's fine. But this is what the positives and negatives really should be based as. So positive things from the Munich Putsch: Hitler was able to write Mein Kampf and put this idea on paper. He wasn't punished harshly. The Nazis who did die were seen as martyrs, and this was important because it gave them a hero sort of to rally around. They got lots of media attention because everyone in Germany had heard of them, and they got lots of sympathy, lots of hate to the Weimar government as a result of the things they'd done, and this just increased. Negative things: he goes to jail, so he's now a criminal. Dislocating his shoulder is negative as well. Ludendorff disassociating himself with the Nazi Party was actually a big negative because he was the kind of main name supporter for a while. The fact that their newspapers and things had to be banned for 2 years did put them out of politics for a while, so that was quite negative. And they were seen to be criminals because they had attempted treason. So that put a lot of people in high positions of power off supporting them, but not everybody. So if you haven't done the table, pause this one and use this one to complete that task. This picture shows you Hitler in his cell. You can see him sitting looking very happy in the bottom corner here, along with some of what would become his most trusted advisors. They are also prisoners with him, and they are allowed to just wander in and out of each other's cells. The doors weren't even locked most of the time, and they were given preferential treatment while they were in prison. So even though he was in prison, it wasn't a particularly awful ordeal. So ultimately, why did the putsch fail? So this is key things that we're going to write down. So why did the putsch fail as a heading? 3 main reasons why the Beer Hall Putsch actually failed. Hitler did not have enough support in Germany to overthrow the government using violence. He had not planned carefully enough how to actually seize power or what he was going to do once he had it. And the leaders in Bavaria turned against him. So these 3 reasons are the main reasons why the putsch failed, and key points to put down in your notes. The consequences of the putsch and the trial. the failed putsch turned Hitler into a celebrity and he became a national figure. His trial was reported in all the national newspapers. He was allowed to make long speeches about his ideals, even in prison, to anybody who came to visit him, including journalists. Membership of the Nazi Party increased, and he was able to write the book about his views. And Hitler also realised that the best way to get into power was through popularity in the ballot box. So can you pause the video on this one and make a copy of this diagram for your notes, just to summarise the consequences of both the putsch and the trial into one area. So, was the Munich Putsch a failure? The Nazis did not seize power, so yes, it was a failure in that respect. And Hitler was humiliated and sent to prison, so yes, it was a failure in that respect as well. But it does give Hitler and the Nazis a national profile, which they need if they're going to be successful, and it does allow Hitler to reflect on his ideas. He realises he needs to get power legitimately, not through seizure, and that is going to be key moving forward for him and the Nazi Party. So, how useful question to practice about the reasons for the failure of the Munich Putsch. Remember, 5 marks. I did do a live lesson and go over this, but if you're not sure about the how useful questions, let me know and I'll go over it in a wee bit more detail. Focus on the reasons why it's useful more than anything, and let me know if you have any questions.